So what were world leaders able to accomplish at the summit? I guess the big question is, will we see any concrete action?
Well, I would begin by saying that this summit was never meant to produce a binding agreement, a deal, in the same way that a UN climate summit could, for example. Summit was more of a platform for ideas with, some ideas more concrete than others, with some commitments, some announcements, but not just a groundbreaking deal. And so some of the main commitments came from the World Bank during the summit, offering to pause the debt payments of poorer countries when they're hit by natural disasters. This will only apply to new loan agreements, but it will not apply to existing loans. We've also heard from France, which is set to include a clause in that form for their bilateral and development agency lending. The U.S. will also commit to a similar project in their loans in the coming year. There's also been a lot of talk about IMF SDRs and IMF jargon, so that's special drawing rights. Essentially, what you need to understand, it's an IMF fund with assets, and mostly those assets were available for wealthy nations. Now, if those countries are not using those assets, well, now they will be able to redirect those assets, rechannel those assets to the developing nations coping with the impacts of climate change. So we've heard during the summit that France will rechannel 40% of their allocation, Belgium 15%, for example. And that is why the IMF is pretty confident that the institution will reach a target of rechanneling more than $100 billion worth of assets. And just a short while ago, we heard in that press conference, the IMF chief, World Bank chief, Emmanuel Macron as well, giving closing remarks. And just listening to their remarks, you get a sense that they're just really minor steps paving the way for more substantial reform. IMF chief saying, for example, we are not there yet, but there is movement. The World Bank chief saying there's so much more to be done. So at the end of the day, the outcome, I would say, of this summit has been a consensus that something is broken with the global financial system in the climate crisis era, and that needs to be fixed. But a lot more needs to be done, and that is going to happen at G20 summits, at World Bank, IMF meetings, and of course, COP28.
How does all of this live up or line up with the expectations of nations who are vulnerable to climate change?
Well, civil society, climate vulnerable countries coming here to Paris, they knew that you can't just reform the global financial system with just a single summit. I think that there's, again, the sentiment on behalf of civil society and those countries that what was achieved here is really just minor compared to the magnitude of the challenge. $100 billion sounds like a lot of money, but according to the data, developing nations will need more than $2 trillion every single year by 2030 in order to cope with the impacts of the climate crisis. And just as a point of comparison, $2 trillion is just a little bit less than what is actually being invested every single year in fossil fuel infrastructure. So the money is there somewhere. It's just about putting the money in the right place. And we've been getting some reactions from civil society essentially saying this summit had little to show and it was just dressed the old and new packaging. So definitely some disappointment.
Okay, we'll have to